Hello, I'd like to welcome you tonight to the Linen Quarter and to the Stories That Shape Us. Thank you very much for coming. Great crowd, great to see you all. My name's Chris McCracken. I'm the Managing Director of the Linen Quarter Business Improvement District that's sponsoring the event tonight. And I want to tell you, this is the Stories That Shape Us, so I want to tell you a little bit about some of the stories that have shaped the Linen Quarter. So if you'd been here 250 years ago, this would have all been green fields. Anything behind City Hall was green fields. And not many stories there, but still there are some that come out. For example, Joy's paper mill was in the gasworks. Joy's paper mill was the paper mill that powered what's the newsletter today, and Joy's lane that goes down from the city centre to the gasworks is a reflection of that little bit of history. But the story of the linen quarter really starts properly with the linen boom of the 19th century. And there are three concepts that define the linen quarter of the 19th century and still define the linen quarter today. So the first concept was innovation. In the 19th century, linen had mechanized. It was the first industry of Belfast, preceded the shipyards. And Belfast, or Linenopolis, as it used to be known, brought thousands of people to work in the city. It created a worldwide trade network centred on Belfast and on the linen quarter, and it flooded the city with money. And this money was used to invest in other industries, such as the shipyards. It was used to build our hospitals. It was used to build our cultural icons, such as the Ulster Hall. People were very philanthropic in the 19th century, and that generosity is still with us today. And innovation still defines the linen quarter. We've got Deloitte, Ormo Baths, Fintru, Liberty IT. Even the BBC is as much a technology and innovation company as it is a broadcaster. That's Mark Simpson. And that technology, that innovation, is the future of this city. And just as it transformed Belfast in the 19th century, innovation will transform us in the 21st century. So don't listen to the doom mongers. Future of this city is bright. The second word that defines the linen quarter is transport. And it was Great Victoria Station. I think it was 1829 or 1833, I can't remember. But it opened in the early part of the 19th century. And it was Great Victoria Station that brought the workers into the linen quarter. And the linen quarter then became home. From green fields, it went to tightly packed housing and broad boulevards of the 19th century. And the population of Belfast completely exploded because of linen and because of the transport. And transport remains one of the great concepts of the linen quarter today. We've got a £250 million Grand Central Station opening this year, the end of this year, and that's going to increase passenger movements from 8 million to 20 million people coming through the linen quarter every year, opening up the west, opening up route to Dublin, which I hope one day will be a fast route to Dublin, but we'll leave that down to the infrastructure minister to sort out. But that transport is an exciting concept, and north-south glider coming through, a new bridge at the gasworks, new cycling infrastructure, £30 million on pedestrian from streets ahead coming in. I really do think that under this mandate, we've been waiting a long time for these things, but under this political mandate, this is where these things will start, and I do believe they'll be delivered in the next mandate. So an exciting transport future for the linen quarter. The third story that defines the linen quarter is hospitality. And the new population that came in for the linen industry needed entertainment. So we had the Crown Liquor Saloon, originally called the Railway Tavern. We had the Grand Opera House. We had the Ulster Hall, whose Mulholland organ was a donation from a wealthy linen baron. And all three of these great institutions, these entertainment and hospitality institutions, remain in active service today not only remain but are thriving. And many of the smaller music halls have been lost that once populated the Linen Quarter, but the tradition, the musical tradition, still continues today with lots of musical bars and the Limelight and the Empire, and we've got a great musical district as part of a musical city. And we've also spent, in terms of that hospitality, £180 million in hotels in the Linen Quarter. The refurbishment of the Clayton is one, and so I do hope you enjoy the hospitality on offer tonight. And there is, just on that, tea and coffee after, if you want to stay. I don't have time to tell you about the stories of the many people that are associated with the Linen Quarter. From Randolph Churchill, that foolish man who said Ulster should fight, to Terry Hooley, that much more sensible person who said Belfast should party. Sir Otto Jaffe, who had what is now the 10 Square Hotel. Thomas Thompson, whose fountain is just outside. Henry Dunlop, who was on May Street, who created the pneumatic tyre for bikes, I would say, not for cars. So hopefully we'll get back to bikes at some point in the future. The stories are many, but here tonight we hope we will hear from more stories, 5 more stories, and it's my great pleasure to welcome the 5 public figures to the Linen Quarter to tell us their stories tonight. John Barry, Nuala McKeever, the Reverend Andrew Foster, Tara Mills, and Marcin O'Muller. Their stories become our story and become the story of the Linen Quarter itself. Thank you very much. And I'll just pass on to my very good friend, Reverend David Campton. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris. Thank you to the Linen Quarter and all of the support that you have given us over the years, not just for this event. And it's okay, Martin McGill already has an event in mind for next year as regards transport, so watch out for that. It is great to be back here, despite the fact that I don't have a hoodie on. The reason I don't have a hoodie on is because it's soaked after today's walk. But I am one of the organising committee of the Four Corners Festival. And I will be introducing the various contributors this evening. I do, before we begin, just briefly need to say thank you to all of those who make not just tonight, but the whole festival possible, the Linen Quarter and our other funders, but also that they make it possible for us to offer the festival free to you. But as we keep saying to those who keep coming, it may be free to you, but it's not free to happen. So we do need your support, and you can make donations in the various buckets that you will see here, or online, or wherever. But you can also contribute to the festival in terms of shaping our ideas for years to come. And that's part of the survey that you will get. You've applied for your ticket online. You will get a prompt to fill out a survey online. We really do value the feedback that we get back from those surveys. They help to shape our programme for next year, or at least that programme for next year that Martin hasn't already filled with ideas. But it is my great pleasure, as part of this year's festival, our stories towards a culture of hope. We wanted this year, story has always been a big part of Four Corners Festival. Listening to each other's stories and encouraging people to listen to different stories in different places. That's the whole point of the festival. But this year we wanted to we wanted to focus on culture, because, if it hadn't been for Brexit, this might have been Belfast and Derry sharing the city of culture. But let's leave that open wound. But we wanted to emphasize that culture is a good thing. Culture can be used as a weapon in Northern Ireland, sadly. We want to engender a culture, but a culture of hope. I'm not naturally an optimist, but I'm with Desmond Tutu, who always says, I'm not an optimist, but I'm a prisoner of hope. And we want to engender a culture that is a hopeful culture. And tonight, we have invited 5 public figures to come and share with us books, stories that have helped to shape their lives as they've gone, and to share some of their story in the light of that. We've given each of we have a team of actors who will read out some of those stories, or excerpts from them, and then they have 7 minutes. You've heard this, John Barry, 7 minutes to offer their reflections on it. But just by way of introduction first, just why story? Will Storr, in his book, The Science of Storytelling, refers to human beings as storytelling animals, and to story as the language of the brain. Story or narrative is hardwired into our being. So much so, we don't actually realize it. Literary scholar Barbara Hardy says, we dream in narrative, daydream in narrative, remember, anticipate, hope, despair, believe, doubt, plan, revise, criticize, construct, gossip, learn, hate, and love by narrative. Philip Pullman, the famous children's author, says, children need art and stories and poems and music as much as they need love and food and fresh air and play. Some anthropologists suggest that story and its most immediate form, gossip, is the very glue that bound early humans together and made us the formidable species that we have become, for good or ill. And most of the Bible, at least 50% of it, including what the Jewish people call the law, the Torah, is conveyed in story. Why? Well, the late Chief Rabbi Jonathan Sacks suggests that this is because the truths of the human condition are simply too deep to be understood at once and on the surface. Only stories have the depth, the ambiguity, the principal multiplicity of meanings that we need. And originally, the Bible was conveyed by oral tradition. And as Claire Haynes reminded us last week at our Sunday event, societies such as our own in Ireland and Scotland and the whole the Celtic fringe tradition have a vibrant oral storytelling tradition. The Shanachie and the fabled gift of the gab conveyed by kissing that Blarney stone. Yeah. But as with the Bible, the oral stories became captured in writing. First in parchment scrolls and later in books. And until the advent of film and television, that became the most prominent vehicle for enduring stories. The books had a range way beyond that of the ancient campfire, and a transformative power that the bards of old would have died for. Anatole Boyard once wrote in the New York Review of Books, "A good book is never exhausted. It goes on whispering to you from the wall. Books perfume and give weight to a room. A bookcase is as good as a view, as the sight of a city or a river. There are dawns and sunsets in books, storms, fog, zephyrs. I read about a family whose apartment consists of a series of spaces so strictly planned that they're obliged to give away their books as soon as they've read them. I think they've misunderstood the way that books work. Reading a book is only the first step in the relationship. After you've finished it, the book enters on its real career. It stands there as a badge, a blackmailer, a monument, a scar. It's both a flaw in the room, like a crack in the plaster, and a decoration. The contents of someone's bookcase are part of their history, like an ancestral portrait. So we're getting a glimpse tonight into a small part of someone's bookcase. I am a Methodist minister, and the founder of Methodism, John Wesley, claimed that he was a homo unius libri, a man of one book, meaning the Bible. This was probably to contrast with the supposed words of Thomas Aquinas, hominum unius libri timeo, I fear the man of one book. But if truth be told, Wesley was a liar. He was a widely read man who encouraged others to read widely and indeed published a cheap library of books that he recommended to others. Tonight, we have asked our contributors to be men and women of single books, but I trust that they are much more widely read than that. But we want to hear one book, one story that has shaped them and why. We're assisted in this tonight by 3 actors from our regular collaborators at Bright Umbrella, a small professional theatre company in the Sanctuary Theatre in East Belfast, who will read chosen excerpts from the books chosen before each contributor speaks. They are, in the order that they will appear, Glenn McGivern, an actor from Ballymena who trained at the Royal Birmingham Conservatoire, and last year worked with us performing Simon Peter in A Farther Shore, which Bright Umbrella are now set to take to Edinburgh this coming August. Trevor Gill, who's currently the artistic director of Bright Umbrella. In the past, he's appeared in plays for the BBC, Royal Shakespeare Company, and has worked as drama facilitator for the Arts Council, Northern Ireland. And Eleanor, an actor, writer and singer from Dromore, County Down, who trained at the Drama Studio London and Guildford School of Acting. She has suffered for her art. She's only recently had surgery on her wrist after injuring herself on a previous job. So it's good that she's here tonight. Hopefully there will be no injuries this evening. But let me introduce the first of our contributors. Professor John Barry, a father, a political activist, recovering politician, and Professor of Green Political Economy in the Centre for Sustainability, Equality and Climate Action at Queen's University. He's co-chair of the Belfast Climate Commission, a member of the Committee on Climate Change Economics Advisory Group on Adaptation and Resilience. Need snappier titles, they really do. And a member of the Sustainable Future Committee of the Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust. And can regularly be seen on environmental protests and union picket lines around the university with his beanie hat on. He had to wear the hat so that people would recognise him tonight. But those protests are because his professional life is driven by the life opportunities and future well-being of his and other children in this age of the planetary emergencies. John's chosen book for this evening is The Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, written in German largely by Marx in January 1848 against an imposed deadline. I know how he felt. It was published anonymously as a 23-page pamphlet in London the following month, later expanded to a whole 30 pages, but never have 30 pages so influenced the history of the world. Translated by Helen MacFarland in serialized form in the Chartist magazine, The Red Republican. And it was this edition that first revealed the author's identities. The whole pamphlet is based on a Hegelian dialectic, don't you know? And since there were ostensibly two authors, the chosen excerpt will be read by two of our actors.
In bourgeois society, living labour is but a means to increase accumulated labour.
In communist society, accumulated labour is but a means to widen, to enrich, to promote the existence of the labourer.
In bourgeois society, therefore, the past dominates the present.
In communist society, the present dominates the past.
In bourgeois society, capital is independent and has individuality, while the living person is dependent and has no individuality. And the abolition of this state of things is called by the bourgeois abolition of individuality and freedom. And rightly so. The abolition of bourgeois individuality, bourgeois independence, and bourgeois freedom is undoubtedly being aimed at.
By freedom is meant, under the present bourgeois conditions of production, free trade, free selling and buying. But if selling and buying disappears, free selling and buying disappears also. This talk about freedom in general, selling and buying, and other brave words of our bourgeois about freedom have a meaning, if any, only in contrast with restricted selling and buying, with the fettered traders of the Middle Ages, but have no meaning when opposed to the communistic abolition of buying and selling, of the bourgeois conditions of production, and of the bourgeoisie itself.
You are horrified at our intending to do away with private property. But in your existing society, private property is already done away with for 9/10 of the population. Its existence for the few is solely due to its non-existence in the hands of those 9/10.
You reproach us, therefore, with intending to do away with a form of property, the necessary condition for whose existence is the non-existence of any property for the immense majority of society. In one word, you reproach us with intending to do away with your property. Precisely so. That is just what we intend. From the moment when labour can no longer be converted into capital money or rent, into a social power capable of being monopolised, i.e., from the moment when individual property can no longer be transformed into bourgeois property, into capital, from that moment, you say, individuality vanishes.
You must therefore confess that by individual, you mean no other person than the bourgeois, than the middle class owner of property. This person must indeed be swept out of the way and made impossible.
Communism deprives no man of the power to appropriate the products of society. All it does is to deprive him of the power to subjugate the labour of others by means of such appropriations.
It has been objected that upon the abolition of private property, all work will cease and universal laziness will overtake us. According to this, bourgeois society ought long ago to have gone to the dogs through sheer idleness. For those of its members who work acquire nothing, and those who acquire anything do not work. The whole of this objection is but another expression of the tautology that there can no longer be any wage labour when there is no longer any capital.
All objections urged against the communistic mode of producing and appropriating material products have, in the same way, been urged against the communistic mode of producing and appropriating intellectual products.
Just as, to the bourgeois, the disappearance of class property is the disappearance of production itself. So the disappearance of class culture is to him identical with the disappearance of all culture. That culture, the loss of which he laments, is for the enormous majority a mere training to act as a machine.
But don't wrangle with us as long as you apply to our intended abolition of bourgeois property the standard of your bourgeois notions of freedom, culture. No, it's it. Your very ideas are but the outgrowth of the conditions of your bourgeois production and bourgeois property, just as your jurisprudence is but the will of your class made into a law for all, a will whose essential character and direction are determined by the economical conditions of the existence of your class.
When, in the course of development, class distinctions have disappeared, and all production has been concentrated in the hands of a vast association of the whole nation, the public power will lose its political power. Political power, properly so called, is merely the organized power of one class for oppressing another. If the proletariat, during its contest with the bourgeoisie, is compelled by the force of circumstances to organize itself as a class, if by means of a revolution it makes itself the ruling class, and as such sweeps away by force the old conditions of production, then it will, along with these conditions, have swept away the conditions for the existence of class antagonisms and of classes generally, and will thereby have abolished its own supremacy as a class. In place of the old bourgeois society with its classes and class antagonisms, we shall have an association in which the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all.
The communists disdain to conceal their views and aims. They openly declare that their ends can be attained only by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions.
Let the ruling classes tremble at a communistic revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Workers
of all countries, unite!
It's even better in the original German. It's September 1985, and I've just started university. I was able to go to University College Dublin on the south side of the city because I got good enough grades on my leaving certificate. But more importantly, my father had an accident in the factory in which he worked, which took our family income below the threshold that I was able to get a temporary covering of costs for a year. I remember three things in the build-up to that September. One was an awareness that even though I was quite a smart kid, there were others even brighter than me who didn't go to university, largely because their families couldn't afford it. The second was that I remembered in my Irish oral examination one word that has still stuck with me, dífostíocht, which translates as unemployment. At that time in Ireland, not only did we have issues of unemployment and emigration, but also major issues in my community, a working class housing estate on the north side of Dublin with heroin. And I also remember, thirdly, the careers session we had before we broke up for the summer, wherein working class kids we were given two presentations. One was from a married family, extolling the virtues of married life and raising children, and the other was from a priest, asking if anybody had had a vocation. My community was the working class community of North Dublin, Millbrook, Edenmore, Darndale. It's ravaged at this time by heroin. And yet at university, I'm surrounded by people with posh accents of my own age, with winter tans, a phenomenon I never knew was possible, and all drinking something called Heine, which I discovered was a trendy middle-class South Dublin name for Heineken. My working class accent sticks out because there's not many others like me in the mid-1980s going to university. Traveling as I do each day from the north side to the south side is like traveling between two worlds, worlds separated by accents, wealth, confidence, clothes, tastes, and all based on class differences. In one of my politics classes, I am introduced to Marxism and the Communist Manifesto. While not fully understanding this book, written in 1848, it speaks to me. It helps me explain and understand my own growing class unease, my class consciousness. It helps me understand why there's no nice things in my community, and yet there are in the leafy suburbs of South Dublin. Why I have to travel on the Dart and not have a car like other of my classmates. Why my father has a Honda 50 while others have Mercedes. And why I understand through an analysis offered in Marx and Engels' book that this system of capitalism is based for the benefit of the few and not the many. It helps me understand why the people who run our society, in business, in government, in law, all seem to come from the same class background. And above all else, in reading the Communist Manifesto, I really learned the truth of the golden rule. Those who have the gold make the rules. And it also, in becoming a socialist in this way, it raises issues of my own religious upbringing. And it helped me explain a contradiction. On the one hand, there were sins of injustice and poverty, but these are less talked about than other sins like abortion, homosexuality, and divorce in RE classes and in Mass on Sundays. But later I would learn that there is a compatibility between religion and particularly Christianity and socialism, which quite attracted me. And it's summed up in a quote I still use to this day from the Archbishop from Brazil called Helder Camara, who said, "When I give food to the poor, they call me a saint. And yet when I ask why the poor have no food, they call me a communist." And becoming a socialist, as I did in my early career, both as an activist and also as an academic, enabled me to understand the difference between charity and justice. Charity is voluntary. There's an inevitable paternalism involved in it, whereas justice is based on equality, and it's also based on getting to the roots of the problem. Charity addresses the immediate effect of a harm or vulnerability, whereas justice goes to the roots. And that's why being a socialist is to be radical, in the Latin sense of that term, radial, radius, getting to the roots. Beginning with the Communist Manifesto, but there are many other Marxist and socialist books that influenced me, particularly The Ragged-Trousered Philanthropist, I become more and more less understanding of the inequality I see around me. How in the midst of plenty, of living in a period of human history where we have the most affluence and wealth, we have poverty and destitution around us. I begin to understand why, despite the working class making up the majority in society, they are not outnumbered, they're out-organized, as Malcolm X wisely said. And what Marx and Engels and later socialists and communists were pointing out is that there is more than enough resources, land, energy, material, that everybody's needs can be met, but not under capitalism. In a way, they were simply updating for the modern era the insights of previous radicals such as the Diggers and the Levellers, who also viewed the earth as in common and the common fruits of all humanity, not the private property of those who used violence to appropriate for themselves and their descendants that which should be a common heritage of humanity. As Gerald Winstanley quite wisely noted in 1649, those that buy and sell land and are landlords have got it either by oppression, murder, or theft, and all landlords live in the breach of the 7th and 8th commandments, thou shalt not steal nor kill. And in these dark days of war, violence, imperialism, and deepening social divisions, I think the insights of Marx and Engels' wee book can give us insights into these very complex and big issues, not least in the consistent anti-war perspective it contains, and which has been a constant feature of socialist thought since the beginning of its origins. As the great Scottish socialist John Maclean stated in his opposition to the imperialist First World War, he said, "A bayonet, that's a weapon with a working man at either end. Betray your country, serve your class. Don't go to war, my friend." And speaking of war, have you ever wondered why there's always money for weapons and not for the NHS? Or when did the last time you ever saw an army general shaking a tin can outside Victoria Square for a few bob for a tank? Finally, I'm grateful for the Communist Manifesto for making sense and providing solutions, I think, to the greatest threat humanity has ever faced, the climate and ecological crisis. I am utterly convinced, after 3 decades of researching, teaching, and writing about this crisis that there is no capitalist solution to the planetary emergency that we now face. What we're now facing is the butting up against capitalist ideology, against the biophysical realities of the earth. Marxism, of course, is not infallible. I leave that to other forms of thinking, and does not provide answers to everything. But as an educator, having read the Communist Manifesto helps me understand the reasons why for most of my students, it is literally easier for them to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. So normalized has this system become in terms of popularized as common sense. Or indeed why my own practice as an educator, which is to co-design my courses with my students, allows them to see this teachable moment, which in a way is informed by a Marxist perspective. Why should democracy end at the seminar door? Why should democracy end at the office door? Why should democracy end at the factory door? And for me, socialism is a process of democratization of more and more parts of our world, and correctly points out that without economic and workplace equality and democracy, political democracy counts for very little. And in these troubling and turbulent times, the Communist Manifesto gives me hope for a better future based on its understanding of the world, realizing the collective power of the working class, the majority in society gathered here this evening, to come together, roll up our sleeves, righting wrongs, comforting the disturbed and disturbing the comfortable. And paraphrasing another Scot, the novelist Alistair Gray, and author of the book upon which the film Poor Things is based, where he said we should work and act as if we're in the early days of building a better world. Or as a fellow Scot, who then became an icon of the Irish radical movement, James Connolly, said, "Our demands most modest are, we only want the earth." Thank you.
Thank you, John. It's always very dangerous to rely on Professor Google for introductions, which is why I asked each of our contributors to send a brief bio for us. For example, on Googling our second contributor, the Right Reverend Andrew Forster, not only did his Wikipedia have a photo linked to it that looks nothing like the man in the front row, I also learned elsewhere that he was a contestant on the 7th season of Hell's Kitchen, where he came 15th. But thankfully, I've known this man, the Right Reverend Andrew Forster, since he was called Fozzie at school. He's been Church of Ireland Bishop of Derry and Raphoe since 2019 and is the current president of the Irish Council of Churches. Who would have thought it back then? He studied at Queen's University Belfast, started his ministry in the city as curate at Willowfield Parish before becoming Church of Ireland chaplain at Queen's until 2002, when he headed out west, first to Sligo, then to Dungannon, before becoming bishop. His chosen book tonight is Baba Yar, a document in the form of a novel by Anatoly Kuznetsov. At the age of 12, the author experienced the Nazi invasion of Ukraine and kept a diary of the brutal occupation of Kyiv that followed. Years later, he combined those notebooks with other survivors' memories to create this classic work of documentary witness. Central to it is the story of the two-day massacre at Baba Yar ravine of 33,771 of the city's Jews, and later Roma, prisoners of war, and other victims on the 29th and 30th of September 1941. One of the largest single mass killings of the Holocaust. This excerpt, which I warn in advance, is traumatic. is the experience of one woman, Dina Pronacheva, who almost escaped by claiming to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, but then was ordered to the ravine at the end of the first day of the massacre in a mopping up exercise.
Dina was in the second group. They went through the gap and came out into a sand quarry with sides practically overhanging. It was already half dark and Dina could not see the quarry properly. One after the other, they were hurried along to the left, along a very narrow ledge. On their left was the side of the quarry, to the right a deep drop. The ledge had apparently been specially cut out for the purposes of the execution, and it was so narrow that as they went along it, people instinctively leaned towards the wall of sandstone so as not to fall in.
Dina looked down and her head swam. She seemed to be so high up. Beneath her was a sea of bodies covered in blood. On the other side of the quarry, she could just distinguish the machine guns which had been set up there by a few German soldiers. They had lit a bonfire and it looked as though they were making coffee on it. When the whole line of people had been driven onto the ledge, one of the Germans left the bonfire, took a machine gun and started shooting.
Dina did not see so much as feel the bodies falling from the ledge and the stream of bullets coming closer to her. The idea flashed into her mind.
Now,
And without more ado, she jumped, holding her fists tight as she went down.
It seemed to her that she fell for ages. It was probably a very deep drop. When she struck the bottom, she felt neither the blow nor any pain, but she was immediately spattered with warm blood. And blood was streaming down her face, just as if she had fallen into a bath full of blood. She lay still, her arms stretched out, her eyes closed.
All around and beneath her, she could hear strange, submerged sounds, groaning, choking, and sobbing. Many of the people were not dead yet. The whole mass of bodies kept moving slightly as they settled down and were pressed tighter by the movements of the ones who were still living.
Some soldiers came out onto the ledge. They flashed their torches down on the bodies, firing bullets from their revolvers into any which appeared to be still living. But someone, not far from Dina, went on groaning as loud as before.
Then she heard people walking near her, actually on the bodies. They were Germans who had climbed down and were bending over and taking things from the dead, occasionally firing at those who showed signs of life.
One SS man caught his foot against Dina, and her appearance aroused his suspicions. He shone his torch on her, picked her up and struck her with his fist. But she hung limp and she gave no signs of life. He kicked her in the breast with his heavy boot and trod on her right hand so that the bones cracked. But he didn't use his gun and went off, picking his way across the corpses.
A few minutes later, she heard a voice calling from above.
Dmidenko, come on, start shoveling.
There was a clatter of spades and then heavy thuds as the earth and sand landed on the bodies, coming closer and closer until it started falling on Dina herself.
Her whole body was buried under the sand, but she did not move until it began to cover her mouth. She was lying, facing upwards, breathed in some sand and started to choke. And then, scarcely realizing what she was doing, she started to struggle in a state of uncontrollable panic, quite prepared now to be shot rather than be buried alive.
With her left hand, the good one, she started scraping the sand off herself, scarcely daring to breathe lest she should start coughing. She used what strength she had left to hold the cough back. She began to feel a little easier. Finally, she got herself out from under the earth.
The Ukrainian policemen up above were apparently tired after a hard day's work, too lazy to shovel the earth in properly. Once they had scattered a little in, they dropped their shovels and went away. Dina's eyes were full of sand. It was pitch dark, and there was the heavy smell of flesh from the mass of fresh corpses.
Dina could just make out the nearest side of the sand pit and started slowly and carefully making her way across to it. Then she stood up and started making little footholds in it with her left hand. In that way, pressed close to the side of the pit, she made steps and so raised herself an inch at a time, likely at any moment to fall back into the pit.
There was a little bush at the top which she managed to get a hold of. With a last desperate effort, she pulled herself up, and as she scrambled over the edge, she heard a whisper which nearly made her jump back.
Don't be scared, lady. I'm alive too.
It was a small boy in vest and pants who had crawled out just as she had done. He was trembling and shivering all over. She hissed at him.
Quiet! Crawl along behind me.
And they crawled along silently, without a sound. They went on crawling for a long, long time, very slowly, coming up against obstacles and turning back and crawling on, apparently right through the night, because it eventually started to get light. Then they found some bushes and crept in among them.
They were on the edge of a big ravine. Not far away, they could see some Germans who had come to sort the people's belongings out and pack them away. They had dogs on leads running around with them. Occasionally, a lorry would drive up to take the things, but more often it was just plain horses and carts.
When the dawn came, they saw an old lady running, followed by a boy of about 6 who was crying,
"Granny, I'm scared."
But the woman brushed him aside. They were overtaken by 2 German soldiers and shot. First the old woman, and then the boy.
Then, on the far side of the ravine, 6 or 7 Germans appeared leading 2 young women. They went down into the ravine, selected a level place, and proceeded one after the other to violate the women.
Having satisfied their desires, they stabbed the women to death with their bayonets so that they shouldn't cry out, and left the bodies there as they were, naked, with their legs spread wide apart.
Germans kept passing by, sometimes above where they lay and sometimes below, chatting to each other. And all the time, shooting was going on nearby. In fact, there was so much shooting that it began to seem to Dina that it had been going on forever and had never stopped, even during the night.
She lay there with the boy, and they kept dozing off and waking up again. The boy told her his name was Motya, that he had nobody left, and that he had fallen into the pit along with his father when they had started shooting. He was a good-looking child, with lovely eyes, which looked at Dina as though she was his saviour. If they managed to escape, she thought to herself, she would adopt him.
Towards the evening, she began to have hallucinations. Her father, her mother, and her sister came to see her. They were in long white robes, and they kept laughing and turning head over heels.
When Dina came round, Motya was sitting over her and saying plaintively,
"Don't die, lady. Don't leave me."
she had the greatest difficulty in realising where she was.
Since it was already dark again, they dragged themselves out of the bushes and crawled on. While it was daylight, Dina had made note of the direction, across the big meadow to the wood, which she could see in the distance. Occasionally, she would forget where she was and try to stand up, but Motya would hang on to her and force her back down.
She must have been losing consciousness, because at one point she slipped down into the ravine. They had nothing to eat or drink for more than 24 hours, though they didn't give this a thought. They were in a state of shock.
So they crawled their way through another night until it began to get light again. In front of them was the undergrowth in which they had decided to hide, and Motya went ahead to spy out the land. They repeated this procedure several times. If the coast was clear, Motya was supposed to shake a bush. Suddenly there was a piercing shout.
"Don't move, lady! There's Germans here!"
And she heard shooting. They killed him on the spot.
As luck would have it, the Germans had not understood what Motya had shouted. Dina crawled back and found herself on a patch of sand. She made a little hole, carefully filled it up with sand, and made a little mound above it, pretending to herself that she was burying Motya, her companion, and then burst into tears. She was already a little lightheaded.
When daylight came, Dina found that she was sitting, rocking from side to side, right on the roadway that to her left was a fence, a lane, and a rubbish tip. She crawled quickly across to the tip, made a hole for herself in the rubbish, covered herself over with bits of rags and boxes, and put an old basket on her head so that she could breathe inside it.
And she lay there, scarcely breathing. From time to time, Germans would pass by, stop, and light cigarettes.
Right in front of her, on the edge of a garden, she could see 2 green tomatoes. To get them, she would have to crawl across to them, and it was only then that she began to feel thirsty and to have hunger pains.
She tried to think of something else, closed her eyes, argued with herself, and tried to force herself not to think. Still, her head kept turning, drawn like a magnet in the direction of the tomatoes. But she did not crawl out. She lay there until dusk.
Only when it was absolutely dark did she extricate herself, find the tomatoes with her hands, eat them, and crawl away again on her stomach. She had already done so much crawling. She seemed to have forgotten how to walk properly.
She went on crawling for a long time, then fell into a trench with barbed wire and lost consciousness. Towards morning, she awoke to find herself near a cottage with a barn behind it, which she decided to enter. It wasn't locked, but she had hardly gone in when a dog started barking.
Then all the neighbors' dogs started yapping as well. It seemed to her that hundreds of dogs were barking, and noise was the last thing she wanted.
A woman came sleepily to the door and shouted,
"Quiet, Liabko."
She glanced into the barn and caught sight of Dina. She did not look particularly well disposed, so that when she started asking Dina who she was and what she was doing there, Dina decided to lie, saying that she was on her way back from digging trenches a long way away, and that she had lost her way and decided to spend the night in the barn.
She asked how to get to the town commandant.
"Where have you been?"
Near Belaya Tserkov.
Belaya Zerkov. You're trying to tell me this is the road from Belaya Zerkov? Come on, come on.
Dina was, of course, looking frightful. She was covered in dried blood, mud, and sand. She had lost her shoes back in the quarry, and her stockings were torn to shreds.
The noise brought out the neighbours, who slowly gathered around Dina, looking her up and down. The woman summoned her son, a boy of about 16.
Vanko, go and fetch the Germans. We'll show her the way, all right.
Dina stood there and realised she could not run away. She hadn't the strength, and in any case, the woman would start shouting and send the dogs after her.
The Germans were apparently quite near, because Vanko returned with an officer almost at once.
Look, sir, a Yid.
The officer inspected Dina and nodded,
Come.
and he started walking off along the little footpath, Dina following behind. He said nothing, only looking round from time to make sure she was following.
She walked with her arms folded across her breasts, all hunched up. She was cold. Her right arm ached. It was covered in blood. And her legs were hurting from all the cuts and the bruises.
They entered a single-storey brick-built house in which was a large window covering almost the whole wall with lots of smaller panes.
And it was then that Dina saw that she had crawled right round Babi Yar and finished up in the very place she had run away from.
Sort of feel after that I need to apologise if you were hoping for a fun night out. You know, it is quite a story. And whenever David got in touch about this evening, I thought long and hard about what book and what was the story that I wanted to share. And I suppose it could have been sort of scripted and predictable and maybe a bit obvious as well. You know, it wouldn't surprise you if a bishop had chosen the Bible, or I hope it wouldn't surprise you if a bishop had chosen the Bible. And it still shapes me, and it comforts me, and it challenges me, and it quietens me, and it amplifies me, and all those things, of course it does. As an Anglican, it mightn't have surprised you if I'd chosen the Book of Common Prayer. that has shaped my devotional life and my worship over all of the 56 years of my life. But I sort of get the feeling that predictability is not what the Four Corners Festival is all about. So although there are a number of different books of different genre that I could have gone for, I chose Baba Yar by Anatoly Kuznetsov. It is, and I hope you saw or heard and witnessed by those incredible actors, an extraordinary book. It was first published in censored form in Russia in 1966, and Kuznetsov defected from the USSR to the UK in 1968. He decided he had to get out of Russia after the Soviet army invaded Czechoslovakia, and he smuggled out the uncensored version of the book. He had photographed his manuscript in 35mm photographic film. And the book vividly, painfully, shockingly records the Ukrainian Holocaust of the Second World War. Now, sometimes a book becomes precious to you for a number of different reasons. And this one is a bit special for me at the moment because it was given to me by a very dear friend who was a real bibliophile, used to read a lot. And he came up to visit Heather and I in Derry last summer just, and he said, I think you'll find that interesting. And he gave me this book, and after a conversation we had had about the invasion of Ukraine, and Tom, who gave me the book, actually just over a month ago, I conducted his funeral. So he's a very dear friend, and the book becomes all the more precious because of that. But it is a fascinating read, because you'll see if you ever open it that some portions of it are in bold print and others just normal type. The bold print were all the bits that the Soviet people wouldn't allow, that the censors wouldn't allow in it. And then it was printed the full McCoy, if you like, after he defected. Baba Yar was this ravine on the outskirts of Kyiv where the Nazis used as a killing ground for the city's Jewish population and anyone who the Nazis viewed outside of their own political will. The story was written from the contemporary notebooks of a boy between the age of 12 and 14, which I find remarkable when you read those stories of a young boy. And it's this shocking eyewitness account of a curious, resilient schoolboy. To be honest, and you'll have witnessed this, I found it a difficult read. Sometimes I just had to put it down for a week or so and then go back to it and then put it down again. I found it a difficult read. But sometimes a difficult read can be the book that does become part of your story and speaks into some of your own thought patterns and speaks into some of the things that matter in life for you. And in a sort of in a very bizarre way, and I get it as a bizarre way, it sort of spoke to me about even, our own current situation in this part of the world that we love and live in. There's a number of things spoke to me about it. That there is always in history a very fine line between civility and chaos. It is a very, very fine line. And we have witnessed that fine line being crossed too often. We witness it being crossed even today. There's that fine line between civility and chaos. And, if we are people who are concerned for the common good, if we are people who are concerned for community, we need to be sure that we know what side of that line we wish to be on. The other thing that it told me and speaks to me historically, that if we demonize an individual or a group of people, the next logical, if perverted, step is to harm them. That is the logical step of demonizing somebody. It is to harm them. That's what we saw from, in the story, from a nation that was incredibly civilized, that demonized, hurt, and then sought to destroy. And we see it today. It also spoke to me about the resilience and ingenuity of the human spirit. The writer becomes a young entrepreneur. He sells single cigarettes, old newspapers, everything to keep his small family going. We see the ingenuity, the entrepreneurship, the resilience of the human spirit. And, sometimes maybe we don't feel resilient. We can feel very delicate. But yet there is something within us that helps us take the next step of life. Whenever I read it, I thought, how on earth can you take the next step in life living through experiences like that? But the history of it is that people did take the next step. There's a resilience to the human spirit. And it also, and I'm sort of loath to say this bit, I think it also speaks something of the danger of thinking a political system, is the be-all and end-all of life. Politics matters, politics counts, of course it does. But humanity, love, grace, mercy, morality, it actually isn't found in political constructs. I think it's found deeper in faith. I think it's found deeper in understanding what it means to be made in the image of God and understanding everybody in humanity to be made in the image of God. I don't live in this city. I live in the premier city of Northern Ireland, in Derry. I live in a city that's so important it gives itself lots and lots of different names. It's called Derry, it's called Londonderry, Stroke City, the Maiden City, whatever you want, the Walled City. Derry was a city that was ignored. It was destroyed, to be honest. It was destroyed. It was crucified. Yet it's now a place that's been resurrected. It's a place that is full of hope. It's a beautiful place. Come and visit. It's a place that I would even say has been redeemed. It speaks of the hope of the human spirit. It speaks of the resilience of the human spirit, even in the darkest of times. Baba Yar, this book speaks of something absolutely dreadful and appalling that we all know must never be forgotten. But it also speaks something of what it means to be a prisoner of hope in the midst of dark and difficult days. So I recommend it to you.
So you're not getting an easy night. The following excerpts are not as long or as harrowing as the one that we have just had, but we need books that challenge us as individuals, that challenge systems, that compare and contrast, and make us realize that no one story can capture the full picture. Our next contributor, Tara Mills, spends a lot of time telling stories on our nightly news at 6:30 on the BBC and co-presenting Radio Ulster's Drive Time programme. But before presenting, she was a reporter for almost 20 years, covering some of the biggest news stories on these islands. She has a special interest in disability rights, mental health, learning difficulties. And last year, she allowed herself to become part of the story. In the enormously moving documentary, Tara Mills' Life After Loss, which chronicled Tara and her nephew Finn's journey to Zimbabwe to retrace the last days of her brother and Finn's father, Richard Mills, a frontline photojournalist who died by suicide 15 years ago whilst working in Zimbabwe. Tara's book tonight is Blue Sky July, subtitled A Mother's Story of Hope and Healing, or, depending on what edition you get, A True Tale of Love, Light and Impossible Odds by Naya Wynne. Published in 2008, it's an autobiographical story by a journalist. Is that why it resonated? I don't know. Whose son was diagnosed with severe cerebral palsy 6 months after he was born. The following excerpt, in the voice of the author, tells of her son's coming into the world.
If we could only ever keep one feeling from the whole of our lives, I'd choose this one. When heaven lands inside me. Joe Alexander is born in hospital at 1:07 p.m. on Saturday, the 29th of August, 2 weeks early. He weighs 6 pounds and 10 ounces, gets 10 out of 10 in his APGAR scores, and has skin the colour of a pearl. He is perfect. Alex can't keep his deep brown eyes off us. Our son has jet black hair, blue eyes, and a cry that I've known longer than I've known myself. He is far more beautiful than we'd imagined. We make our phone calls to family and friends. It's a boy, we say, and all is well. As smiling nurses breeze in and out, and the sun drops in through the window, spellbound. It brings a new sense of time, this feeling, a new sense of love, a sense of the miracle. Alex says it's as if we've been enlightened. If I could keep one feeling from the whole of my life, I'd choose this one, this time, when just to be human feels divine and nothing is wrong. It's the strangest time, a birth, for life to start falling apart. Just like that. The very next moment, it's rare, but it can happen, and it happens to us. It's so easy to slip between worlds, silver to black. There's nothing in between. Sometimes it's just a trip down the corridor between heaven and hell. It was 3:16 p.m. when his skin turned a duskier shade of pearl and the nurse stopped smiling. When she wheeled him off on a silver trolley to intensive care and we chased her down the corridor as if she had taken our insides away. His skin is ashen, his body shakes, and his cry is changed so that even I don't know it now. We sit at the edge of an incubator like children astonished, Alex and I, as the doctor's summations merge with the irregular bleeps like a shipping forecast we can't understand, and we tell him over and over how much we love him. So suddenly, it's all there is to say.
Thank you so much. Oh my goodness, I am slightly beside myself after that. So beautifully read. Thank you. So I have always loved small stories. The smaller the better. Lord of the Rings was not for me. Oh my word, I had to leave the cinema every 20 minutes to go and stretch and gather my thoughts and take a deep breath and go back in. Gladiator left me feeling overwhelmed. And don't even start me about Titanic. But when I say small, I don't mean insignificant. Far from it. Give me a Claire Keegan book and I am in heaven. Or a story of one person's battle to get sober. Or Kathy Rensenbrink's story about the love she had for her brother and how, after suffering horrendous injuries in a road accident, the family fought to keep him alive and then years later found themselves in court getting permission to switch off his life support. Her book, The Last Act of Love, was the one I was going to talk about. It's the one I bought for other people more than any other book, and I highly recommend it to all of you. I am fascinated by the human spirit, similar to the story we've just heard. What is it that keeps people going in the face of awful adversity? The Times columnist Melanie Reid, who became a quadriplegic after a riding accident, encapsulates exactly what I mean. The minute detail of how, when her body couldn't work, her mind was the thing that kept her alive. Her book, The World I Fell Out Of, is also one of my favourites. The battle she fights on a daily basis makes any feat of physical adversity pale into insignificance. And the more normal person, the better. I don't read biographies of the rich and famous. I want to read a memoir of someone no one has really heard of. I'm pretty sure nobody else in the room has read this book. Am I right? Has anybody else read it? So I'll get to that. I'll get to it. Blue Sky July by Nia Wynne. So that has followed me in my career as well. Dr. Jim Swire, who lost his daughter Flora in Lockerbie. When I worked in Scotland, he was the first person I interviewed who fitted into what was to become a long list of people who, when faced with enormous tragedy, channel that grief and trauma into a fight for truth and justice. Don Sims, whose son Jonathan had CJD, a remarkable man whose devotion to his son Jonathan, it was just remarkable how his attention to detail and his tenacity in the face of constant knockbacks from the authorities, it was simply incredible to watch. The Bloody Sunday families, Michael Gallagher from Omagh. Now it's the Muckamore families, the survivors of the mother and baby homes. It's Mags McGuckin, who spent her life fighting for others who'd been abused in children's homes. And when you read her backstory, it's clear to see why. Human beings can be cruel and heartless, evil and murderous, but they can also find strength when it seems impossible. When you look at what's happening to them and think, how can they fight this? But in the very hot summer of 2008, I came upon the book Blue Sky July, and its impact was really life-changing because it was my story, but told by someone else. It was what I was going through that summer in the middle of a heatwave, and yet it wasn't my story, it was hers, but it was the same. Her book is a memoir starting in 1998, so she was 8 years ahead of me. Like me, she was a journalist, and like me, she gave birth to a son. As we've already heard, she said it's so easy to slip between worlds, silver to black, there's nothing in between. It's the blink of an eye. Sometimes it's just a trip down the corridor between heaven and hell. And she finds herself with a very poorly child in the same hospital as all the perfect mothers and the perfect babies and all the perfection of unconfined joy. I honestly can't remember how I came to find the book. On the cover, it says it's the book of the month on Radio 5 Live. It's the book of the week for BBC Radio 4. But I know for a fact that summer I was not listening to the radio. Her story it's unimaginably sad and incredibly difficult to read. But at that time, it gave me enormous comfort and taught me many, many things. That it's okay to grieve the child you thought you were going to have, and that the bond between a parent and child can be cast iron, unbreakable. It's quietly brilliant, and what she went through in 1998 and beyond is unimaginable. She manages to describe every feeling and emotion in beautiful descriptive prose that would stop anyone in their tracks. Every interaction with the medical profession, some of them insensitive and hurtful, and others who literally saved her life, it was all familiar. Each page I turned, I recognized a similar experience, the same emotion, the same anger and sadness at the place we found ourselves. Yet in that time of stress and distress and pain, something happened to Nia. That strength of the human spirit kicked in, the Herculean effort to stay positive and fight for the child that can't fight for itself. I remember vividly people with older children who had disabilities saying that they wouldn't change them for the world. And at the beginning thinking, how incredibly stupid is that sentiment? Of course you wouldn't wish this on anyone. How ridiculous to condemn a child to a life in a chair or unable to speak or hear or see. And that's what the book also taught me, that in fact, we are the lucky ones to be given the chance, the responsibility, and the absolute honour to guide a child with challenges through life. How thankful that they're with us and not abandoned or neglected, so like so many others. Nia Wynne showed me how low the bar is set when a child has additional needs, or should that be that the parent has additional responsibilities. So when a child not expected to survive does just that, the sense of euphoria is indescribable. When the child who's not expected to speak says hug, the joy is immeasurable. And that was Nia Wynne's talent in this book, and what I soon realised, that actually the human experience is indeed universal, albeit in categories and experiences we don't expect or desire to find ourselves in at the time. And that the love of a parent for any child can be the biggest and strongest bond we'll ever experience. And it's borne out in the expression that you might die for your partner, but you'd kill for your child. Though, of course, I'm not suggesting that's a good idea. I have met many Nia Wynnes along the way, mothers and fathers, foster mothers and fathers, adopted mothers and fathers. And one in particular I know is celebrating her son's 21st birthday this month with a big party. She's quietly loved and cherished her son for all those years through very similar adversity. He hasn't been able to attend school since he was 14. He's had multiple surgeries and hospital stays, and she has been by his side, quietly loving and keeping him alive with no thought for her own needs. I often meet them and wonder what his life would have been like without her and what hers would have been like without him. And while we celebrate world leaders and stars and make films about shipping disasters and wars across the centuries, I will forever be more interested and more in awe of the Nia Wynnes of this world who've quietly fought battles that none of us can really appreciate unless we've walked in their shoes.
So we've had big books, massively influential books, small books, books that are given, books that you share all over the place. What are the books that fit into those categories for you? Our third contributor, Marcina Mulwar, is a publisher. Fourth. Sorry, don't want to panic you. Fourth, we are on the fourth. Marcin is a publisher of the Andersonstown News in Belfast and the Irish Echo in New York. He's another recovering politician and a long-time friend of the festival. This year we actually took a self-denying ordinance as an organising committee and not having any local politicians take part in our events for fear of endorsing anyone in an upcoming election. Instead, part of our plan for tonight was to have the Right Honourable Steve Baker, the Northern Ireland Minister, who was to take part tonight. And until Wednesday, that was still part of the plan. When he came down with some plague that meant that his GP wife wouldn't let him fly. He was to speak on How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie. And I'm just leaving it there, okay? But when he couldn't come, we put out a panicked phone call, and at the last minute, Marcin stepped into the breach. Although I did have to make it clear to Mr. Baker's office that replacing a Northern Ireland minister with a former Sinn Féin MLA was not a political statement. When not doing his day job and pulling us out of a hole, Marcin helps organise a whole series of events promoting Belfast, including the Ashling Awards here, the New York New Belfast Annual Summit, and as he says, he runs for his life regularly. Marcin's book is Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut, originally subtitled The Children's Crusade, A Duty Dance with Death. It's a 1969 semi-autobiographic anti-war novel with a bit of time-traveling science fantasy thrown in. It follows the life and experiences of Billy Pilgrim from his early years to his time as an American soldier. The text centres on Billy's capture by the German army and his survival of the Allied firebombing in Dresden as a prisoner of war, an experience that also led to the foundation of Our Partners, Corrymeela by Ray Davey. This excerpt comes just before Billy's capture.
Billy says that he first came unstuck in time in 1944, long before his trip to Tralfamadore. Now, the Tralfamadorians didn't have anything to do with his coming unstuck. They were simply able to give him insights into what was really going on.
Billy first came unstuck while World War II was in progress.
Billy was a chaplain's assistant in the war. A chaplain's assistant is customarily a figure of fun in the American army. Billy was no exception. He was powerless to harm the enemy or to help his friends. In fact, he had no friends. He was a valet to a preacher, expected no promotions or medals, bore no arms, and had a meek faith in a loving Jesus, which most soldiers found putrid.
While on manoeuvres in South Carolina, Billy played hymns he knew from childhood, played them on a little black organ which was waterproof. It had 39 keys and 2 stops, Vox Humana and Vox Celeste.
Billy also had charge of a portable altar, an olive drab attaché case with telescoping legs. It was lined with crimson plush, and nestled in that passionate plush were an anodized aluminium cross and a Bible.
The altar and the organ were made by a vacuum cleaner company in Camden, New Jersey. And it said so.
One time, on manoeuvres, Billy was playing A Mighty Fortress for Our God with music by Johann Sebastian Bach and words by Martin Luther. It was Sunday morning. Billy and his chaplain had gathered a congregation of about 50 soldiers on a Carolina hillside.
An umpire appeared. There were umpires everywhere. Men who said who was winning or losing the theoretical battle, who was alive and who was dead.
The umpire had comical news. The congregation had been theoretically spotted from the air by a theoretical enemy. They were all theoretically dead now. The theoretical corpses laughed and ate a hearty noontime meal.
Remembering this incident years later, Billy was struck by what a Tramalfadorian adventure with death that had been. To be dead and to eat at the same time.
Toward the end of manoeuvres, Billy was given an emergency furlough home because his father, a barber in Ilium, New York, was shot dead by a friend while they were out hunting deer. So it goes.
When Billy got back from his furlough, there were orders for him to go overseas. He was needed in the headquarters company of an infantry regiment fighting in Luxembourg. The regimental's chaplain's assistant had been killed in action. So it goes.
When Billy joined the regiment, it was in the process of being destroyed by the Germans in the famous Battle of the Bulge.
Billy never even got to meet the chaplain he was supposed to assist, was never even issued a steel helmet and combat boots.
This was December of 1944, during the last mighty German attack of the war.
You know, I love this organisation, but their sense of timing, they invited a Tory who was responsible for the funding, and then last Saturday the government came back. So that's not good timing. So you have to say, look, really you did want to invite local politicians. I think it's appropriate for the Four Corners because they should have been thanked last Saturday. Not for all the prayer, the worth of that I'm not sure. But certainly the work in building bridges in Belfast, building the peace over the 10 years of the festival, over the last 2 years when there was no government. So we'll give them a round of applause. Great, great. And the only thing about timing at this event is you make sure you go on before Nuala McKeever. It's bad to go after Professor Barry, but before Nuala McKeever, so we got that anyway. This is, there's an origin story, as it was for the Reverend Andrew. There's an origin story about this book because it was published in '69. I bought it in 1977 in a small shop in West Belfast, which was run by People's Democracy. I don't know if anybody was here when the novelist started 250 years ago. I think a few were, but some of you may have been at People's Democracy demonstrations at Queen's University at the start of the Civil Rights Movement. And in '77, it was a much smaller group, People's Democracy, and they had a bookshop. And they had in Fublocked and other stuff, because when we used to go to Hates Block protests, People's Democracy would come and sell their paper. And I believe they were Trotskyists, Professor Barry. I believe they were. And they had this really stupid idea. They would give us their paper, and they didn't support the armed struggle. They were a minority in that regard in the demonstrations I was at. But they had this really mad idea. They said if the armed struggle stopped and the IRA stopped their campaign of violence, that support for Sinn Féin would soar. So we would just laugh at them and say, what a stupid idea. And they would sit at the back of the bus, and 4 or 5 of them would sell their newspaper. But they did have a small shop in West Belfast called the Connolly Bookshop. And famously, a patrol of Black Watch passed one day, went into this shop and asked, is Mr. Connolly here? And among the books, it wasn't a bookshop like No Alibis with hundreds of books. The books were face up, maybe 15 books, 20 books. The War of the Flea, The Wretched of the Earth, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And right in the middle of all these was Slaughterhouse 5. I said, well, that's interesting. This is a book I can buy, take home if I'm stopped on the way home by the forces of law and order. I'm not going to get in trouble for having Slaughterhouse 5. And I thought, why are People's Democracy selling a book by as he describes himself, a German-American, 4th generation writer who was disturbing the entire American literary canon? Why was Slaughterhouse 5 important? And Kurt Vonnegut, of course, and I hope you enjoyed the religious references. I'm the only person that had religion mentioned in his excerpt, so I hope I get extra marks for that. And Kurt Vonnegut, of course, was a humanist, and so he didn't really believe. I know the Buddhists believe in nothing, but he didn't really believe in anything, so he's up there now looking down at us, regretting that he got it wrong. And the reason People's Democracy had that book, because it's a subversive book, because it was a book more than anything else, which was an anti-war book. The subtitle of the book is Slaughterhouse 5, A Children's Crusade. And he had this firm belief when he came back from the war, he was going to write a book about his experiences. He was in the slaughterhouses in Dresden when Dresden was firebombed on Valentine's Day in 1945. That's what, if we didn't support the Allies, we would call a war crime. But as we know, the firebombing of Tokyo, the atom bomb in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, those were not war crimes because the Allies do not commit war crimes. Dresden was not a war city. It was a city full of refugees. It was known as the Florence of the Elbe. It was famous for its china, for its universities. And actually during the war, a bit like Oxford, people thought it would never be bombed. But it was devastated in this push by the Allies to end the war, this great urge to end the war in the Pacific and the war in Europe. And ironically, the Allied prisoners were underground in the slaughterhouse. And Kurt Vonnegut said when he came up the next morning, It was a moonscape. Dresden had disappeared. And when he came back from the war, he wanted to write a sort of a John Wayne story about the war. And he was with a buddy talking about it in his house, and a war buddy, and his wife said, "You're going to write this book about heroism and men fighting." And she said, "You were just boys." And she said, "Wars are fought by boys. Now they're fought by boys and girls." And he came back contrite, and he said, "Okay, I'm going to write a different type of book." So he wrote a book, which certainly is an anti-war book. It came out in '69, right during the Vietnam War. But it was speaking about another war. And he thought, I'll make it interesting, so I have a little bit of science fiction, a lot of humor, a bit of time travel, and create something that actually was unique at that time in American literature. So, People's Democracy had it because it was subversive and anti-war. For me, it taught me a couple of things. What a beautiful piece of writing. And so simple, so simple. Every page is beautiful, beautiful prose, but it's neither complex nor deep. It's a book that, I'm sort of ashamed that only the Reverend Foster brought a book with him so far. No, Tara had a book as well, but neither I nor Professor Barry have the Communist Manifesto. I thought you would have it in your back pocket. But I think it taught us the beauty of literature, and that has held with me as well. But what it really taught me is, don't believe the official version. There are, of course, with the exception of Tara and Mark, who are in the room. But never believe anything. Never believe anything, because we are now in the midst of two terrible wars. Actually, on our doorstep, two terrible wars. And what we need peace in a Christian assembly, of course. Nobody's going to lead this call for peace and for ceasefire and for an end to war, except the Christians and except the people of faith. So that's what I'm hoping for. You did very well on our particular problem. Over many, many years, we called for peace and the end of war. So in the spirit of Kurt Vonnegut, fewer wars, more peace. So thank you very much.
Okay, we who, coming from a Christian perspective, are being challenged on our peace credentials by marching in Milwar. I'll leave that there. I got the irony. Nuala, who got the irony, is a comedy writer and performer. She first came to public attention in the sitcom Give My Head Peace, and then was the first woman in Ireland to have her own show, The McKeever Show, which ran on UTV for 3 years. Recent years, Nuala has written and performed several highly acclaimed one-woman plays. In the Window, toured to India and the USA, and her most recent play, Truth, Love or Promise, directed by Dan Gordon, is returning to the Lyric Theatre in August 2024. So those of us who didn't get there the first time, having sold out over 2 weeks, receiving rave reviews, we need to get in quick this time. Her book, The Gathering Light by Jennifer Donnelly, called A Northern Light in its release in 2003 in the US. It was retitled A Gathering Light in the UK to distinguish it from Philip Pullman's fantasy novels. Like Philip Pullman's books, it was marketed at young adults, but has a resonance for all ages. It's set in northern Herkimer County in New York in 1906, and is part murder mystery, part come-of-age novel about a young woman who's an aspiring writer. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Nuala.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me if I hold this down here? Yeah. Hi, thank you very much for that. It's lovely to be here. I didn't actually prepare anything like everybody else did to read, so you've already said a little bit about the book, but I'll say a little bit more about it just to set the scene. Yes, it's sort of 2 books. I've read it about 4 times, but I haven't read it for a few years, so I didn't get a chance to read it all again, but even the little bits I dipped in and out of in the last day or so, are brilliant. It's just, I don't know why it's described as a book for young adults. They could certainly read it, but I mean, it's very much an adult book. And it concerns this young girl called Maddie Koki. She's 16 in 1906, and she lives a difficult life. Her mother has died. She's the oldest girl of 5 children. She's 16. Her older brother Lawton has run away because he's argued with the father. The father is suffering massively from the grief and the loss of his wife, but he's a tough man, unreconstructed male. And the mother was obviously the glue that held the family together, and now Maddie has to hold the family together. And it's Little House on the Prairie-esque, you know, they're bringing in the milk and they're shucking the corn and they're doing all that. And she goes to school and she is smart. And her teacher is a woman called Miss Wilcox, who, as we discover as the book goes on, was married, is a bit, not fast, but, you know, she's kind of before her time. She's a woman with her own mind, and she got married, and her husband didn't like her having a mind of her own, and he more or less forbade her to write or do anything. So she went away, tried to get her locked up. And she got away, the teacher. This all comes out in the book. But she's obviously inspiring to Matty. And one of the devices of the book that's lovely is each chapter, there's different chapters. There's ones, she goes to work in a hotel as an extra job to earn some money. And it's the story of her working at the hotel. It is based on a true story of the death of a young woman called Grace, I can't remember her surname, Grace Brown. Yeah, so in 1906, a young woman's body was fished out of Big Moose Lake. And it was thought that she and her male friend, who were staying at the Glenmore Hotel on Big Moose Lake, had been out in the boat and had an accident. And the book opens with Matty and her little friend working in the hotel, and the boss woman says, "Go on, open the parlour. And they bring this the man carries the body up, and Matty thinks she's still alive and says, "Well, I go and get coffee." And the woman says, "It's too late for that now." And she has this experience of seeing this dead body. But the big story is that the day before, this woman, Grace, this young woman, had handed Matty a packet of envelopes. There were a lot of letters tied together, and told her to burn them. And she never got around to burning them because she was so busy. And next thing, this girl turns up dead. And there's a mystery, and she starts to read the letters. And that unfolds throughout the book. So what has actually happened, the woman has been murdered. I know that's a spoiler, but it's not that big a spoiler. Probably says it on the bloody back of the book. Anyway, so there's that story, which is it's an interesting story, but the main part of the book that really gripped me was the story just of Matty, a young girl who is having to be mother and father and big sister, and, you know, a hard life. One of those books where you just think, gosh, we have it so easy. We can turn on a tap and get water. We can turn on a tap and get hot water. You know, it's incredible. So she's that, but she has this inner life. And you talked, John, you know, from the book that you were quoting, what was it called? Not Das Kapital. What's it called? The Manifesto. Yeah. You know, this idea of poverty. And I mean, one of the big songs is Bread and Roses. The biggest poverty we suffer, probably, I would think, apart from physical poverty, is the poverty of expectation. You know, sometimes you don't need to be policed. Often your society, your family, your circumstances police you enough that you don't even dream that there's anything else. So Matty is a girl who dreams because she's told she's brilliant at writing, and she is given a scholarship to go to college, university, but she needs money to get the train ticket and to live and buy books. And her father, of course, goes, "No daughter of mine's going to go and get an education and do better than I do." You know, that kind of. He's a man who's driven by grief, but from her point of view, he's just a big obstacle. So anyway, so we find her in this bit. When I was asked what book, I was going to pick something non-fiction. You know, I've read so many self-help sort of books. I've read lots of stuff. One called Finding Your Own North Star by a woman called flippin' heck, the old brain. Oh, what's her name? Anyway, your woman. Anyway, that was brilliant. Now, that's a good book. No, that book by your woman about about hang and all that there. Now, that's a good one. I recommend that one. Now. Martha Beck. There you go. Martha Beck. Yeah. Good old Martha Beck. That book did change my life, but I don't have a copy. I've given it away to so many people. And then I remembered this book here. There's a scene that I'm going to read, and there's a line in it. I was reading it out loud earlier, just to time it. And I couldn't actually read this line because it always makes me cry. It's going to make me cry tonight. But it's this, well, I'll read it anyway. The story is Matty's little friend, Minnie. They're 16. Minnie has met a boy and got married. And Matty is stepping out with Royal Loomis, a fella who lives at a farm 2 farms over. And Royal, he's very attractive, and everybody loves Royal and thinks he's gorgeous. But Maddie has a brain and is very intelligent, and Royal is not that intelligent. He buys her a book, and she gets excited because she loves words, she loves books, and he buys her a book, and it's a cookbook. And that implies what he's expecting their life to be, you know, you'll be a wife. So we find her at this bit. Minnie has given birth to twins, so Minnie's only 16 or 17 in this book. And this is the life that, you know, she's thinking side by side. So it's this dual thing, and each paragraph, each chapter starts with a word that comes out of the dictionary, and she looks up a new word every day. I love words, I love use of language, I just love it all. And this, as you'll realize when I read it, why this spoke to me, or any young woman who doesn't know can't even put a name to what it is that she knows she wants, but it's inside and she can't, and because nobody around her sees her or sees it, and then somebody sees it and says, you've got it, but your circumstances are more or less saying, you can't have that, who do you think you are? You know, you can't do that. Anyway. So she's going to meet Minnie in her house. She hasn't seen her for ages since the twins were born, and she wants to talk through this idea that the boyfriend, Royal, is probably going to give her a ring. She knows he's got, not a ring, not that. It's 1906, come on. A ring on her finger, you know. So, and apologies to Casey, who is American, who's here tonight. I said I was going to read this in an American accent. It's set in upstate New York, but every time I open my mouth, I come out like that, and it sounds like I'm down in Georgia somewhere. Anyway, just go with it, for God's sake. Give me a break. Okay, so she's come to see, and she says, I wanted to tell her about Royal, too, and the ring he was going to give me. I wanted to see if maybe she could help me figure a way to both be married to Royal and still be a writer. To be two things at once, like one of those fancy coats that they have in the Sears and Roebuck catalog that you can change into a whole different coat just by turning it inside out. When I got to her porch, the front door banged open. Jim greeted me sullenly, stuffed the remains of a sandwich in his mouth, and trotted down the steps to join the hired hands. Minnie, I called, stepping inside. A nasty smell hit me, a sour reek of old food and dirty diapers. Maddie, is that you? A tired voice asked. Minnie was sitting on her bed, nursing her twins. She looked so thin and drawn that I barely recognized her. Her blonde hair was greasy. Her clothing was stained. The babies were sucking at her hungrily, making greedy, grunting noises. Her eyes darted around the room. She looked anxious and embarrassed. Yes, it's me. I brought you these, I said, holding out the flowers. Oh, they're so pretty, Maddie. Thank you. Will you put them in something? I went to find a glass or a jar, and it was then I noticed how filthy the place was. Plates and glasses, encrusted with food, littered the table and counters. Cutlery filled the sink. Dirty pots covered the stovetop. The floor looked like it hadn't been swept in ages. Oh, I apologize for the state of things, Minnie said. Jim's had 4 men helping him all week. Seems I just get one meal cooked, and it's time for the next one. The babies are always hungry, too. Here, take them for a minute, will you? I'll make us a cup of tea. She handed me one of the babies, wincing as she pulled him off her swollen blue-veined breast. Her skin, where the baby's mouth had been, was livid. Tiny droplets of blood seeped from a crack in it. She saw me staring and covered herself. She handed me the other baby, and in no time flat, they were both screaming. They twisted and kicked. They screwed up their tiny faces and opened their little pink mouths like 2 screeching baby birds. Their diapers were soggy. Their cheeks were rashy. Their scalps were crusty. They stank of milk and piss. I was trying to settle them so they'd stop screaming so the wet from the diapers wouldn't soak into my skirt when the next thing I knew, Minnie was standing over me, her arms at her side, her hands clenched. Give them to me. Give them back. Don't look at them like that. Don't look at me. Just get out. Go. Get out of here, she shouted. Min, I'm sorry. I didn't mean. But it was too late. Minnie was hysterical. She crushed the babies to her and started to cry. You hate them, don't you, Maddie? Don't you? Minnie, what are you saying? I know you do. I hate them too. Sometimes. I do. Her voice had dropped to a whisper. Her eyes were tormented. You hush right now. You don't mean that. I do mean it. I wish I'd never had them. I wish I'd never gotten married. The baby struggled and howled against her. She sat down on the bed, opened her blouse, and grimaced as they latched on to her. She leaned back against the pillows and closed her eyes. Tears leaked out from under her pale lashes. "You're just weary, Min," I said, stroking her hand. "That's all." She opened her eyes. "I don't know, Matt. It all seemed so exciting when we were courting and then just married, but it isn't now. Jim's always at me. Oh, he's probably just worn down too. It's hard work clearing. No, don't be dense, Maddie. I mean at me. But I can't. I'm so sore down there, and I just can't have another baby. Not right after the twins. I can't go through it again. Mrs. Krigo said that nursing will keep me from quickening, but it hurts so. I think I'll go crazy with the pain. I'm sorry, Matt. I'm sorry I shouted at you. I'm glad you came. I didn't want to tell you all these things. I'm just so tired." "I know you are. You lie there for a minute and rest. Let me make the tea." Within minutes, Minnie had fallen asleep and the babies with her. I got busy. I boiled water and washed all the pots and pans and dishes. I boiled some more and set the dirty dish rags and aprons to soaking. I filled the big black washing kettle with water, threw in a pail full of dirty diapers I'd found in the kitchen, and started a fire under it in the backyard. It wouldn't reach a boil for some time, but at least she wouldn't have to haul the water. Then I scrubbed the table and swept the floor. I set the table too, thinking the men would be back in for supper before long. I put my flowers in the middle of it. When I finished, the house looked and smelled much better, and I looked and smelled much worse. Then I heard wagon wheels at the bottom of the drive. I looked out the window and saw Royal already. He and Jim were talking, but he'd expect me momentarily. I'd never even had the chance to tell Minnie about him. As I quickly patted my hair back into place, it hit me. Emily Dickinson was a damn sneaky genius. Holing up in her father's house, never marrying, becoming a recluse. That had sounded like giving up to me, but the more I thought about it, the more it seemed she fought by not fighting. And knowing her poems as I do, I'd not put such underhanded behavior past her. Oh, maybe she was lonely at times and cowed by her pa. But I bet at midnight, when the lights were out and her father was asleep, she went sliding down the banister and swinging from the chandelier. I bet she was just dizzy with freedom. I have read almost 100 of Emily's poems and memorized 10. Miss Wilcox says she wrote nearly 1,800. I looked at my friend Minnie, sleeping still. A year ago, she was a girl like me, and we were in my mama's kitchen, giggling and fooling and throwing apple peels over our shoulders to see if they'd make the initial of our true loves. I couldn't even see that girl anymore. She was gone. And I knew in my bones that Emily Dickinson wouldn't have written one poem even if she'd had 2 howling babies, a husband bent on jamming another one into her, a house to run, a garden to tend, 3 cows to milk, 20 chickens to feed, and 4 hired hands to cook for. I knew then why they didn't marry, Emily and Jane and Louisa. I knew, and it scared me. I also knew what being lonely was, and I didn't want to be lonely my whole life. I didn't want to give up my words. I didn't want to choose one over the other. Mark Twain didn't have to, Charles Dickens didn't have to, and John Milton didn't either, though he might have made life easier for untold generations of school kids if he had. So as I said, I didn't get the memo that told me to write something to say here, but I just thought it probably speaks for itself, really, that. I can't say I grew up like Matty. I didn't read this book when I was a young adult. I was in my 30s, I'm sure. But at every stage in my life, I was married and I left my marriage. I was in the Hole in the Wall gang and I left the Hole in the Wall gang. I was in the BBC and I left the BBC. All the active things I've done in my life have been leaving and getting out, and I've always had this sense of somewhere inside that my wings were batting up against the sides of a cage, and that I needed a bigger cage or a bigger space to express myself. And I'm thrilled at this ripe old age now that I think I've finally made peace with life and with myself. And it's funny, it's like T.S. Eliot says something about you go all around the houses and you come back and you recognize the first. I'm obviously paraphrasing T.S. That's why he's T.S. Eliot and I'm T.S. who? Wow. You come back and find the same place and you know it for the first time. So for me, that is my latest play, Truth, Love or Promise. And I'm not just saying it because I wrote it and I'm in it and I want to make money out of it, but do come and see it. There's a few people here who have seen it. June has seen it twice. She came twice. And no, it is lovely. And the subject of it is 3 women who go to a creative writing class. And it's a very deceptively simple story of ordinary lives. And I think everybody at some point thinks, who am I to write about me? What have I got to say? You know, we are by definition born small and we grow up and we're children and the world is there and we think everybody knows what they're doing. We think the world is run by adults who know what they're doing, and then you become an adult. My God, when you're older than the bloody Prime Minister, you realize the world is run by dorks who don't know anything more than we do. You know, everybody's winging it. And it can either depress the hell out of you or give you a sense of, well, maybe, you know, I deserve my place at the table the same as anybody else. And the beauty of Truth, Love or Promise, it's a lovely unfolding story and layered story. But it's the idea of what this very festival is about, the connection. You know, C.S. Lewis says we read to know we're not alone. I keep saying I think we do everything to know we're not alone. Only connect. We all want to connect. We want to be seen. We want to see ourselves, because ultimately I think the essential thing that Mattie, that drives her, is this knowledge. If you're a believer in God, you would call it faith. I'm not necessarily a believer in a God as such, but I believe we're all one and we have an essential something inside us that knows that we're all the same consciousness looking at itself through different eyes, and that the desire to connect with each other, and we do it, as you say, through story. Story is really what separates us from most other animals, really, is that we, you know, as they say in a course I did called Landmark Education, there's what happens and what we make it mean. We are meaning-making machines in life, and it is our heaven and our hell, you know. We don't just suffer pain in life, we tell ourselves a story about it, and that's our suffering. The Buddhists talk about 2 arrows. First one's the pain, and the second one is the story you tell yourself about it, and that's the suffering, you know. And but at the same time, I wouldn't give up the joy of being a meaning-making machine and give up Mozart and the Beatles and John Barry and all the wonderful things that there are in this world that we get through being human beings. And I think what I love about, I wrote Truth, Love or Promise, but it was like, at the risk of sounding a bit wanky here, it felt like it came to me through, you know, I sat down and it just wrote itself. And it's a bit like a distillation of the last 10 years of my own life. My partner died very traumatically 10 years ago, 11 years ago nearly. And living with loss and connecting with other people through our pain and our suffering and our beauty as well. The great joy of writing that piece has been that you don't have to be an expert, you know. You have a story, other people have a story, and when you open up and you have it's just like, you know, a story can be a prison, what we call our identity. We're brought up as John Hume said, our identity is an accident of birth, and we live inside that very often, and we make it the walls of our prison, and that's your story. And in this play that I've written, basically the premise is, what happens if the story you've believed about yourself all your life isn't actually true? What if somebody says that's not the way it was? Who are you if you're not your story? Well, you're this, you know. You're this, and your huge power is how you respond to what happens to you, not what your story is. And that is power, and I think that's the power that capitalism and wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, and power and media and all that wants to stop people recognizing the fact that when you say, I am going to tell my story, and I am simultaneously then going to be able to step outside my story and see that I'm not defined by my circumstances. I say who I am, and I say what I do. And it's so powerful and simple and thrilling, and you don't need to go anywhere and learn anything. You just need to open your mouth and open your ears and listen and talk. And it takes courage, you know. But when Mike died, I was never one for joining things, and I certainly was not a one for support groups. I'm going to wrap up now. I'm probably talking on too long. Wouldn't be like me. But I was doing a thing for the Arts Council, and I was going up to do a little rehearsal or set up the thing to do an extract of a different play. And I thought I was going to be working with a woman, and I was looking forward to meeting her because she was quite a big wig in the Arts Council. And somebody else came through the door who didn't really smile at me, and I thought, oh, God, you know, the usual thing. You make an instant judgment. I don't want her. I want the one I wanted to be talking to, the head woman. And this girl started talking to me, and I mean, she was all right, and we were getting on okay. And then she said, oh, I knew Mike, because lots of people knew Mike Maloney, you know, my partner. And she then told me that her partner had died very suddenly after 24 years together. They'd been scuba diving in Barbados, and 4 weeks later he was dead in hospital. And I put this line into the play because it struck me so much. And listening to her, I realized this is the first time I've ever heard anybody speaking my language. And I suddenly realized the power of connecting with someone else, you know. And the line in the play, she said, it's like I've been trying to talk a foreign language since my husband died, but with her I can just speak my own language without having to translate everything for everybody. And never mind loss or grief or anything, just to be able to express yourself with somebody else who gets you, to be got on somebody's wavelength. Because God knows a lot of us grew up in our birth families, and I don't know if you're anything like me. No offense to anybody who knows my siblings, but you don't always find your biggest, you don't always find that you're on the same wavelength necessarily with your brothers, sisters, and family. As I say, if it was up to my family to foster my artistic, creative side, I'd probably be working on the tills in Tesco. So we don't always get I'm not saying my family aren't supportive, they are supportive, but you know, there's just, and this would appeal to me about Matty, I think, in this, nobody's born a writer, nobody's born a famous musician or a famous politician or a famous anything, but everybody has the potential inside them to be brilliant, everybody is brilliant. So anyway, it's a celebration of the ordinary and the extraordinary in the ordinary, and I'm a bit like your man who used to lead the SVLP, Mark Durkin. I went to hear him speak one time, and it took him about 20 minutes to finish. He kept saying, so that's really all I have to say now. And he said that about 16 times, and by the end of it we're going, Jesus, you made John Hume sound succinct. And that's saying something. So, in the interest, in the spirit of Mark Durkin, I'll not say very much more now, but this book is called A Gathering Light by Jennifer Donnelly, and it's available to purchase on anywhere but Amazon. Up a workers and ceasefire in Gaza. Thank you.
Thank you, Nuala, and thank you to all our contributors and the stories that they have shared, the books that they've shared, but the stories of themselves that they have shared. And what we invite you to do now is go and have coffee, tea, connect, tell your stories, share the books that you would recommend, get a note paper, see what books that you've heard about tonight that you want to go to No Alibis or another independent bookshop and purchase. And enjoy connecting with one another and sharing those stories. Good night.